4 days, 24 precision missile strikes, 5 fighter jets shot down, hundreds of drones in the air. This is the tally of a brief but intense exchange of courtesies between Delhi and Islamabad, whose consequences are highly significant. When Indian air forces crossed Pakistani airspace on May the 7th, however we look at it, a kinetic exchange between nuclear powers had begun. The specter of war that has haunted the Indian subcontinent for decades once again became a real possibility. The confrontation between India and Pakistan has continued intermittently for decades, ever since the British Raj dissolved and the partition of the subcontinent occurred. The causes of this rivalry consistently remain unresolved territorial disputes, covert state-sponsored terrorism activities, religious tensions, nuclear blackmail, and irreconcilable nationalist claims. Zbigniew Brzeziński classified this region as a part of a cauldron of instability he called the Eurasian Balkans, due to its strategic unpredictability. However, the latest escalation is not just another chapter of traditional rivalry. To maintain proper perspective, two nuclear-armed states engaged in direct armed confrontation using drones, airstrikes, cruise and ballistic missiles. And so, what is the anatomy of the 4-day limited war between India and Pakistan? What are the strategic implications for both actors and international environment? That's what we will cover in today's episode. Welcome to the 20s Report. The terrorist attack in Pahalgam, which claimed the lives of 26 people, showed how quickly an international crisis can escalate into direct armed conflict. Military conflicts, especially those involving nuclear powers, have unpredictable consequences for financial markets and economic stability around the world. In times of geopolitical uncertainty and shifting power balances, having the tools to manage your finances properly is essential. The XTB investment app, partner of this episode, offers access to a range of solutions that will allow you to manage your money effectively in these unpredictable times. Take advantage of the volatility of the financial markets by investing in over 6,000 stocks and ETFs from around the world, with no commission on trades up to 100,000 euros per month. And if you don't see any opportunities yet, or you are waiting for a better moment to act, your funds in XTB continue to work for you thanks to interest on free funds in your accounts. Check out XTB offer by clicking on the link in the description. This way you support the development of our channel. Remember that investing involves risk. As a retaliation for a deadly terrorist attack against Indian tourists in Kashmir committed by Islamic militants, presumably backed by Pakistani intelligence services, India launched Operation Sindoor. Tactically, this counterattack was calibrated to target jihadist headquarters and infrastructure, militant training camps, military sites and air bases on Pakistani soil. Rather than a full-scale Clausewitzian war, the scope of the Indian, quote, special military operation was restrained and measured. In fact, the ultimate strategic purpose of this offensive was to restore the credibility of Indian military deterrence, impose punitive costs on the Pakistani government for supporting violent non-state actors, redefine bilateral terms of engagement in case of hostilities, and to demonstrate Delhi's strategic escalation dominance. Yet perhaps the top objective of Indian military statecraft was to highlight that, despite Pakistan's nuclear arsenal, Islamabad's clandestine support for Islamist militant proxies as vectors of aggression against India will not go unpunished from now on. In other words, the Indians intended to permanently rebalance the existing correlation of forces without the costs of relying on nuclear threats or a high-intensity land conflict that could turn into a grinding war of attrition. From a long-range perspective, this course of action is consistent with a trajectory of India embracing calculated risks in order to project the image of India as an aspiring great power, willing to do what it takes in such pursuit. A recent example of said policy is the targeted killing of a high-profile Sikh separatist leader on Canadian soil a couple of years ago. Also, it must be borne in mind that Indian statecraft leveraged this opportunity to show resolve, leadership and strength after the navigational setbacks and challenges derived from sudden overthrow of a Bangladeshi government close to India, as the result of popular unrest last year. In accordance with the rules of an operational landscape where the boundary between conventional and unconventional warfare is blurred, Delhi mobilized resources to wage psychological warfare through social media and suspended freshwater supplies to Pakistan, despite the existing legal provisions of the Indus Waters Treaty. Moreover, there are signs that India is willing to give a platform to Baloch separatist movements in order to fuel tribal agitation behind enemy lines and weaken Pakistan's internal cohesiveness. Although Indian policymakers in charge of the war effort did not achieve a spectacular success, they made a point about both the seriousness of Delhi's national security red lines and the versatile potential of Indian defense assets. In hindsight, the short-lived Indian campaign seems to have borrowed strategic concepts from the Israeli playbook about the periodical necessity to degrade adversarial readiness. Modi takes lessons from Bibi Netanyahu's playbook. An additional factor that must be taken into account is also Indian domestic politics, particularly considering the dominant Bharatiya Janata Party's desire to reverse declining electoral support. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a political champion of Hindutva, as an ideology which codifies the revival of Indian imperial traditions, intended to score political points with fellow Indian hardline nationalists by rallying around the flag. In this regard, Modi's government portrayed Pakistan as a Schmittian existential enemy and demonstrated India's assertiveness as a self-confident Sanatan civilizational state, meaning eternal dharma, that is reclaiming its rightful place in history as a part of its heritage. This fact is underscored by the name Sindoor, which derives from the reddish cosmetic powder worn by married Indian women as an identity marker that evokes devoted attachment to the traditional Indian way of life. Conventional wisdom would dictate that India's numerical economic, demographic, military and territorial superiority would lead to a decisive, overpowering victory. However, although Pakistan did not completely vanquish Indian forces, it did not surrender either. Based on Cardinal Richelieu's logic of realism, Islamabad did not need to defeat India in a conventional sense, but merely stand up to them. Despite the prevailing disparities, Pakistan reminded its southern neighbor that its very existence as a force to be reckoned with is an effective shield that prevents India's rise as a regional hegemon. Equipped with Chinese-made early warning systems, missiles, electronic warfare hardware, and Chengdu J-10 fighters, the Pakistani armed forces managed to showcase that Delhi's air power is not strong enough to claim supremacy over Kashmiri skies. In this theater of engagement, the most resonant example of Pakistani military competence was the destruction of Indian warplanes, including imported French Rafale and Russian MiG and Su aircraft. The forcefulness and precision of the Pakistani counterattack encouraged Delhi to accept a ceasefire, negotiated thanks to the unexpected intervention of the Trump administration, before the escalatory ladder of the conflict could go further. Pakistani political determination and material capabilities may also have convinced Indian naval forces to abort a crippling attack against the port of Karachi, a major cornerstone of the Pakistani economy. All in all, the wartime mobilization of Islamabad's military muscles demonstrated that it can afford to assume a standoffish stance towards India. Aside from a qualified battlefield performance, another Pakistani achievement was a strong gravitational pull which attracted substantive foreign support. aside from the reaffirmation of Chinese strategic patronage, manifested in deepening military and geo-economic ties, the narrative image of Pakistan as a champion fighting on behalf of the wider Muslim world earned the diplomatic support of Islamic states, such as Turkey and Azerbaijan. According to open sources, Ankara even provided military supplies. Apparently, Turkish-made Songar drones were used by Pakistan in cross-border swarm attacks against Indian air bases, logistical nerve centers, and weapons deposits. In contrast, India was not overtly backed by other members of the Quad, BRICS nations, neighboring Asian states, or even heavyweights with close connections to Delhi, such as the US and Russia. With these results, the higher military echelons of the Pakistani deep state leveraged the crisis to consolidate and legitimize their internal political leadership. Thus, the popularity gathered thanks to skill of Pakistani generalship managed to compensate for the political fallout derived from the controversial and conspicuous ouster of former Prime Minister Imran Khan. Although both sides have claimed an ambiguous victory for themselves, a sober and nuanced situational assessment reveals that this temporary cessation of hostilities is far from being a conclusive outcome. In an increasingly polycentric world order, both Indian and Pakistani hardliners have an incentive to reactivate hostilities in order to settle this enduring dispute. There are already signs which point in such a direction. For example, Congress-led Indian opposition forces recriminate that, despite Prime Minister Modi's fierce nationalist rhetoric, his administration, unlike that of Indira Gandhi half a century ago, arguably lacked the courage and determination to fight until the capitulation of Pakistani troops. In turn, the Pakistani High Command has no long-term strategic, political, or military incentive to stop funding, equipping, and training jihadist groups, to outsource dirty work as an asymmetric equalizer against Delhi's superiority in conventional firepower. The northern part of the Hindustan was one of the major flashpoints in the original Great Game involving the British and the Tsarist empires. Today, the region is still worth fighting for because of its pivotal position at the crossroads of imperial pursuits. Herculean geographical obstacles, strategic choke points, trade networks, and valuable deposits of natural resources. Hence, the ripple and spillover effects from the latest Indo-Pakistani skirmish will likely cause destabilizing consequences beyond the actual battlefield in various ways. How? First, the intensification of direct and indirect geopolitical competition between India and China over access to strategic Central Asian raw materials is to be expected. For the Chinese, Pakistan can operate as an agent of denial that keeps in check Indian geoeconomic moves. Under these circumstances, states like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan will scramble to perform a complicated balancing act, capable of accommodating competing Chinese, Indian, Russian, and Western interests. Second, the plausible reactivation of frozen conflicts, separatist movements, and sectarian rivalries can impact the completion of Chinese-led interconnectedness projects, especially those related to energy, trade, logistics, and digital infrastructure. For example, those associated with the Belt and Road Initiative. Third, the proliferation of militant jihadism, either spontaneous or directed, and its involvement in interstate confrontations can engulf Iran, Afghanistan, Xinjiang, and much of post-Soviet Central Asia. Fourth, the conflict evidences the limited instrumental usefulness of blocs like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to manage underlying tensions, tame the forces of chaos, and guarantee regional security, because there are few common denominators aside from a shared interest in both de-dollarization and the configuration of a multipolar balance of power. India is a member of BRICS, and Pakistan aspires to this membership. But this does not prevent both from harboring fierce hostility toward each other. Fifth, such developments together will accelerate militarization, security competition, geopolitical alliance reconfigurations, proxy wars, and a gradual arms race in South Asia. An additional shockwave unleashed by the recent Indo-Pakistani four-day war is an increased level of tension between the diasporas of both countries in multicultural Western states, such as the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. A malevolence that could trigger street violence. Thus, the echoes of the conflict can be exported to distant corners of the earth. And how do the great powers view all this? In order to avert the risks that come with overstretch and hubris, the United States is becoming less inclined to intervene in Eurasian crises, in which vital US interests are not at stake. Unsurprisingly, the second Trump administration was outspoken in its reluctance to get involved. This time Washington mediated as a facilitator of a short-term diplomatic solution, likely because the US intelligence community noted the prospective dangers of an uncontrolled escalation. However, American diplomats may not be willing to act as a middleman when the following cycle of confrontation between Indians and Pakistanis breaks out in the coming decades. And their Chinese and Russian counterparts cannot easily jump in and play an equivalent role, because the foreign policies of both Beijing and Moscow are not impartial enough. And so an absentee broker that can be trusted by both belligerents means that next time the intensity of conflict may go further. Indeed, the consolidation of a multipolar world order means that tensions between Delhi and Islamabad will become increasingly harder to manage. So who is the winner of the entire situation? It appears to be China, as the incident in which Indian and Chinese troops attacked each other with sticks and stones in Ladakh back in 2020 shows that rivalries between China and India persist. Their shared membership in multilateral frameworks, such as the SCO and BRICS, and their triangular ties to the Russian Federation have diffused tensions to a certain degree. Nevertheless, Indian and Chinese interests are incompatible due to competing plans surrounding Tibet, the availability of strategic resources in proximity to Sino-Indian border, influence in Southeast Asia, the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, and the status of Pakistan. From the viewpoint of Chinese statecraft, Pakistan has proved its usefulness as an expedient instrument of strategic distraction that prevents the development of an Indian sphere of influence beyond the immediate geopolitical perimeter of the subcontinent, and also a key ingredient of a strategy to encircle India. In addition, clashes between India and Pakistan provided a realistic lab to test the effectiveness and reliability of Chinese defense technological outputs against French and Russian weapons. With this business card, the Middle Kingdom improves its position and reputation as an arms exporter. However, through the results of its unwavering support from Islamabad, Beijing has indirectly fired a warning shot whose shockwaves are felt beyond the epicenter of this experimental clash by those with the intent of challenging Chinese national interests. Without fighting, Zhongnanhai, that is Beijing Palace, expects that Taiwanese independentists, US forces stationed in Asia, hawkish Japanese nationalists, Indian hardliners, and even Russia's strategic community are all paying close attention to what the Great Dragon has to say. Moreover, the conflict poses awkward challenges for Russian foreign policy that require caution. Since the Soviet era, the Russians have regarded India as a specially privileged strategic partner. Today, Russia remains a major arms exporter to India, as well as a source of energy resources. Based on an enduring diplomatic closeness, Moscow has also backed Indian positions on Kashmir. From the Indian perspective, Russia is also a trusted bi-directional backchannel to hold discreet unofficial talks with China. A collaboration that is helpful for détente and the preservation of strategic stability in Eurasia. Yet, there are limits. Just like Delhi has not openly backed Russia in the Ukraine war, Moscow is not interested in appropriating India's geopolitical rivalries. On the other hand, despite exploratory overtures that did not achieve game-changing breakthroughs, Russia and Pakistan are natural enemies. Pakistani co-sponsorship of the Afghanistan Mujahideen as a joint venture with the CIA is remembered by the Kremlin with resentment to this day. The Soviet KGB was even suspected of masterminding the mysterious air crash in which Pakistani president Zia-ul-Haq was killed. In the post-Cold War era, later waves of Pakistani-backed Wahhabist militias are a source of concern for Russian geopolitical interests in Central Asia, and even for socio-political stability in the Russian republics in which the Islamic faith has a strong demographic presence. In contrast to Moscow's inroads in other countries from the so-called Global South, the Kremlin has not been very successful in making friends in high places in Pakistan. Nonetheless, Moscow is not eager to antagonize Islamabad just to please India, because of Pakistan's position in China's strategic orbit. Moreover, in a context in which Russia is trying to diversify its international economic exchanges in Asia, Pakistan remains a potential buyer of Russian hydrocarbons. Finally, the role of Pakistan as a trigger of enmity between India and China, as long as things do not get too problematic, is convenient for Russian statecraft because it creates incentives so that both Beijing and Delhi rely on Moscow as an anchor of stability in the Asian balance of power. Russia certainly behaves as a revisionist great power in the post-Soviet space and Eastern Europe, but it has a vested interest in the preservation of the status quo in much of the Asia-Pacific without having to take sides. The 4-day Indo-Pakistani war is merely a foretaste of what may come. India and Pakistan have shown that the new realities of warfare, precise, swift, calibrated, are proliferating beyond the fields of Ukraine as well. Meanwhile, in a multipolar world, where traditional mediators are losing influence and nuclear powers are increasingly boldly reaching for force, any local conflict can cascade into a larger kinetic exchange. The Indian subcontinent is another powder keg that, should the world slide toward chaos, could unexpectedly explode.